Thanks everyone for coming. Technical right away, ready to start waiting on me. So again, working with
Yes, we have a finance guy. He might be killing us.
Sorry. Nope, I'm just muting the person who's, Yeah. there you go. Yeah, I have that power.
Here's me Brad for a second.
Yep.
So Dave said, an excellent internship, and we're looking forward to seeing where he lands with the job opportunities, and had some good start on that with the visit to the Sloan Analytics Conference, so looking forward to that. Excited to have him share his work here. The format is generally give him 35 to 45 minutes to do his presentation, and we sort of have the balance of the hour for audience questions, faculty and other students and other guests if you want. After those questions, we'll retire to the committee to ask him to dig in him a little bit more to sort of complete the process of his defense. If anybody has any questions that are clarification questions, don't hesitate to reach out. You can let people, you don't know your preference. If you want everybody to wait for everything for the end, that's fine. But if the clarification, we can usually do that during, and then larger questions we'll save for the community.
Yeah, I would echo that statement of clarification questions, please bring them up. I would be happy to explain them. But if it is a question that, if it is not a clarification question, I do ask that you please hold it till the end. Kind of got off the rails with that a little bit during the proposal. It threw me off a little bit, but anyway, but thank you all for being here. Both you are here present in the room and those who are here virtually. It's been a long time to get here. It was a long couple months to get here, truthfully. But this is my thesis. It is the title is, does pulling the goalie lead to a playoff appearance? So first, well, there you go. We're going to do this the old fashioned way. So first off, we have this pulling goalie is a hockey specific topic. So first let's introduce what hockey is. The National Hockey League is one of the big four North American major sports leagues. It is the least popular. However, it still generates $6.2 billion. That is for the 23-24 fiscal year as reported on in Sports Business Journal. That is a league high mark. The NHL is only growing. Attendance is rising throughout all teams. Some teams have historically had bad attendance rates, but they are growing as well. Franchise valuations are on the rise as well. When the watershed moment for the NHL was after the 2004-2005 lockout, teams are valued very poorly, but now franchise valuations are on the rise, up 23%. I'm sorry, I have to mute someone again. Yeah. Yep. So, apologies for that. But as you can see, this is the best year for the NHL since the 1990s, and just it is a growing sport. I hope this can help gauge some interest in it. But as they say in hockey, let's do that hockey. So first, since this is very specific, a gameplay decision, we first should go over just to set a baseline for everyone. What takes place during a game of hockey? What are the positions? Teams play with 5 skaters and 1 goalie. They can have 6 players on the ice at the time. You can note them here. The left, you have 3 forwards denoted by the left winger, center, and right winger. They are more often than not going forward on the ice to score more goals. They're a lot focused on offense. Behind them, you have the 2 defensemen, left and right defensemen. They often stay back. They're the last line of skating defense for teams before you get to the goaltender. The goaltender stays in the goal most of the time. We'll get to the specifics on that, but most of the time they are staying in the goal so that they can stop any puck coming towards the net. But all 5 skaters normally move up or down the ice at will. There are different strength codes within a game. So with penalties in ice hockey, a team they're penalized by losing a player. They have to play one man down. And so if the center takes a penalty for the blue team, that center has to sit in the penalty box and the team has to play without him. That is referred to as 4-on-5 for the blue team or 5-on-4 for the red team. There are different zones. Using the blue team as an example, this right here is the defensive zone for the blue team. They're defending this net. They do not want goals scored in this net. In between here is the neutral zone. Both teams control this. It's a transition area between play. And then for the blue team, this would be the offensive zone. They're trying to score goals into that net and move forward. There are 3 20-minute periods for ice hockey for the game, and so if the game is tied after regulation in the regular season, 5-minute 3-on-3 overtime is played, 3 skaters on each side. When referring to the strength code, I should say it does not include the goalie most of the time. 6-on-5 will be different, but so for each game, you can get points, standing points associated. The team that wins in any fashion gets 2 points, no points for a regulation loss, and 1 point for an overtime or shootout loss. Now, when I say points, I could be referring to 2 different things in hockey. Standing points refer to the team accumulating regarding their record, but you can also hear individual points being the statistics that individual players gather. So for example here, a goal is a point and an assist is a point towards that player point total. It is used for evaluation. And so Jason Robertson led the Stars in scoring this year with 80 points, whereas this chart for standing points is from the 22-23 season. So the Stars had 47 wins, which would be 94 points, 21 losses where they get nothing, and then they get 14 additional points for losing in overtime. So when I'm saying standing points, I am referring to the picture on the left. And if I ever say individual points, it is about skater specific marks. But with that baseline set, pulling the goalie is a desperation move. It'll be referred to as 6-on-5, all skaters going forward. This is usually done when a team is down 1 or 2 goals late in a game. The earliest adoption that I could find was by New York Rangers coach Frank Boucher in 1940. He pulled it at a very conservative 1 minute left. The strategy has since adjusted since then. We'll go into some of the research on that, but a lot of the research has been done on when to pull a goalie. The purpose of this study is to address a gap in the literature on its long-term viability. The research focuses on when to pull, assuming this strategy is optimal to helping teams win games, get to overtime, or make the playoffs. But the purpose is to evaluate that and help address that gap in the literature. So the research question is, does pulling the goalie lead to a playoff appearance? And as you can see with these boxes for the 22-23 regular season, the cutoff line for the playoffs is 92 points, and the 2 teams right outside the playoffs both had 91 points. And to explain, the top 3 teams in each division make the playoffs, and then 2 wildcard teams make the playoffs in each conference. And so that extra point from either a shootout loss or 2 points for a regulation win in the East could have put Pittsburgh or Buffalo into the playoffs over the Florida Panthers. Just to show how razor thin these lines are and how those margins matter in the NHL. And even though the Panthers got in by 1 point, they made it all the way to the Stanley Cup final that year, playing for the trophy. So once you get into the playoffs, anything can happen. But the question is, why is this study significant? One of the big things is playoff games provide more revenues for teams. These are games that you get on top of the 41 home games you're guaranteed and 82 games throughout the course of the regular season. Coaches and players have a chance to win the Stanley Cup, often described as the best trophy in sports. And it is a big deal to win that. Players can leverage performance in the playoffs for a pay raise. Some players can say they're better playoff performers. So there's an incentive for players to make the playoffs, to use those and get a raise for their next contract, maybe move teams and all that. And then fans have a chance to witness history as well. Some teams have never won a Stanley Cup. Other teams are going for dynasties, but it is always a moment in history when a team wins the Stanley Cup. So, but that brings us to the research hypotheses. The null hypothesis is that pulling the goalie in a National Hockey League game does not impact the probability of gaining standing points or making the playoffs, and therefore has no relationship on making the playoffs, where the alternate hypothesis would be that it increases probability. So just where I'm getting the data from, some of these delimitations. Data is collected from the Hockey R package in the R programming language. It includes play-by-play data for the past 6 completed seasons, being the 2016-17 season through the 22-23 season. And this includes the regular season and not playoffs. Because the playoffs are a best-of-7 series, first to 4 wins, the point system is thrown out, and so strategy changes quite a bit to be considered in this study. So just some of the limitations. This data is only from the National Hockey League. There is reason to believe that it is accurate, because why would the NHL put out bad data? And these are trained professionals who are logging this play-by-play game summary data. One of the big assumptions that we have to make is that coaches are win maximizers. There are 2 schools of thought in sports business: win maximizers, or win maximizing, or profit maximizing. One of the big assumptions in front offices is that you're profit maximizing. You're trying to make the most money every time. That can be making the playoffs. That can be we're gonna sell quite a bit of players and just focus on making money off that. Or anyway, but coaches are trying to win maximize, because if they lose, they get fired. It is a performance-based position, and so they will try to make a decision based on moving optimally and securing their job. Here are some operational definitions. Just for example, the goalie is an ice hockey player dedicated to stopping shots on goal and the last line of defense against opposing teams' scoring chances. They can be pulled for an extra attacker, otherwise they must remain in the net. But moving on to the literature review, I found during the literature review, the sources used to preliminary find these articles was terms including pulling the goalie, hockey analytics, and goalie. There were some books encountered from previous undergraduate coursework here at OU, and research articles talking with other students in the program, and even a master's dissertation from this program. The peer-reviewed articles were found through Google Scholar and then accessed through the OU library system if they were not available on Google Scholar. But the sections of literature that that have been grouped is the overview of the analytics movement in North American sports as a whole, moving from that into just general hockey analytical topics right now. And then the big one that has had a lot of research: when to pull the goalie. But the genesis of the North American analytic sports movement can be traced back to Moneyball. This book was by Michael Lewis. It followed the 2002 Oakland Athletics. They did at the time, and still do, have one of the lowest payrolls in Major League Baseball, compared to teams like the New York Yankees, who spend past the luxury tax because New York's a bigger market than Oakland. There's a lot of revenue discrepancy in Major League Baseball. So Billy Beane, the general manager at the time, focused on making decisions and finding players who have a high on-base percentage. In-game stat compared to the batting average that was on the time. If you've seen the movie, the famous scene of, because he gets on base more leads to more runs, leads to more wins. They set the AL winning streak record at the time that I believe has since been broken, American League record. And they made the playoffs with one of the lowest payrolls in baseball. Unfortunately, it ends in the division series, but the proof of concept was still there, and it did lead to the growth of what has been determined in baseball to be sabermetrics, these analytical tools to help evaluate players better, and it's been widely adapted by the league. Moving on to football, the first kind of big topic of football would be, I found in Scorecasting, which is a book going over trends, analytics, and psychological trends in sports as a whole. The big one for football is going for it on 4th down. They found that teams should be more aggressive, go for it far more often. for 2011 standards compared to now. But they also found that coaches are more risk averse. If I go for it and it's a 4th and 2 on our own 40, we don't get it, they're right there. It's better just to punt. But Aaron Sagel's thesis from this department focuses on this same subject, but it had the long-term view over a season, whereas scorecasting was very individual as well. Her research focused on scoring more points, when maximizing throughout the season based on optimal 4th down decision-making for all teams over many years. Her findings were somewhat inconclusive. She did find that it leads to more points. However, it does not impact win maximization and lead to more wins. But again, you have an in-game decision metric like going forward on 4th down, like baseball's on base percentage. Kind of starting to transition to hockey a little bit. This book, Stat Shot by Rob Volman, is a summary hockey analytics book. It focuses a lot on player evaluation and team construction, evaluating the player's individual points to predict these things, goalie metrics such as goals against average, save average, who is the best one, who deserves how much should you spend on this person or not. And then Nanda Kumar and Jensen wrote kind of a summary article over the entire industry 3 years later, and talking about a lot more pace of play metrics, such as Corsi, which is accounting for the shots for a team that they took versus the shots they gave up. So the Stars are shooting and they shoot 60 times, whereas the Vegas Golden Knights shoot 30 times. The Stars have a Corsi of plus 30. The Vegas Golden Knights have a Corsi of minus 30. There are more metrics to it, but that is the basic kind of, it is to help really drive who's controlling the pace of play compared to other general metrics as well. So starting to move towards hockey specifically, a lot of the focus is on team production. Butteray, Washburn, and Price use dynamic programming to predict scoring rates for players and teams from the 2008-2009 season. The model was built using goals as Poisson events. They happen every so often, using the time goals. And at the time, there were only 30 teams in the league to compare it against. They did find that their results were accurate in predicting outcomes of games and defensive metrics for teams. And it was a statistical improvement over real scoring rates that can somewhat indicate luck involved with this. It also did show that analytical modeling is useful in hockey, but there might not be great in-game decision-making, especially back in 2011. You also have more team-specific ones. This is a visualization by Pelleggi et al. For the IEEE Viz conference, paper that was submitted there, focused on shots for teams. They did also have say that you can make it for players. They just focused on teams in their article for an emphasis on location and result. You can compared to typical shot charts where they're just dots saying this person took this shot for an individual game. They focused on the season-long implication of, okay, so this team's shooting here. The thicker bands, darker colors mean that they shot a lot from that area compared to lighter bands. You can see where a team is trying to shoot from. That can help influence a coach's game plan for certain teams or not. But it still doesn't cover an in-game decision topic like you see in the other North American sports. And then Swanson, Coban, and Brundage, utilized Google's PageRank model to predict playoff series outcomes. This is where they used Corsi in this one to test if machine learning was worth applying within hockey, using the seasons of 2008, or the seasons that ended in 2008 through 2016 because of those playoffs. They accurately predicted the outcome 70% of the time just based on the Corsi metric, and as their main one, they did also include some offensive and defensive team controls as well. It did show that machine learning is applicable in hockey, but it was still needed a lot of refining in their current state back in 2017. So moving on to a little bit more player-specific ones, this article focused on different shot factors to predict like an expected goals value for people. It was a logistic model just to predict the likelihood that someone had scored a goal in that shot using shot angle. So where they were from the net, like the angle they were shooting at the net, the location where they were on the ice using exact coordinates, and then the angle change. Angle change is a little bit different. So I shoot and the goalie saves it, but it comes flying out at another angle to my teammate who shoots it into the net. It's called a rebound. And rebound chances are very good chances, and a lot of players thrive on rebound goals like that. So it was important to include in that model as well. It did rank players based on offensive and defensive performance, being that I was on the ice for a goal scored +1. I was on the ice for a goal against -1. It's just kind of a predictive plus minus compared to an observed plus minus. But plus minus can be hard to gauge at certain points. If a player is kind of even, is he real? How can you really tell? But it gets a lot better on the extremes. Okay, this person's on the ice for 30 goals against, and he was only on the ice for 5 goals. You can maybe drive something from that compared to a tighter range. But that kind of covers all the general hockey topics, and just decision making long over a team level. The big in-game decision is when to pull. The first time I could find this covered in peer-reviewed research was in 1986 by Alan Morrison and Ronald Wheat. And then there was another publication using this same data by Alan Washburn, who we saw earlier, in 1991. Both findings kind of said that teams should pull with 2.5 minutes to go. And at this time in the 1980s, teams were pulling with a minute to go, still kind of using that first approach that Boucher used. They used 2 different approaches to find that. Morrison used Poisson distributions, random events at random times, whereas Washburn used like dynamic programming, a little bit more cumulative effort, but they did end up with that similar conclusion. And then it kind of stayed dormant for a while. More research popped up with similar findings, but Bodine and Swartz in 2010 analyzed different game states, being 5-on-5, 5-on-4, to indicate when you should pull a goalie. So they used publicly available data from the NHL website. Data had become a lot more common and accessible during this time. They used Bayesian parameter estimates for a souped up Monte Carlo simulation, where just simulating the games to say, all right, likely to happen at this time. And so when the higher average number of standing points gained, referring to the team level, at that point, with that time remaining, that is when you pull the goalie. Using the entire game, not comparing it to likelihood to score, just, all right, we're going to get the most points if we pull at this time, or we can't likely get the most points at this time, or not. Compared to this, that's the time they say to pull. That it's comprehensive for coaches because, like, okay, this state at this time, pull. But compared to Asness and Brown, this is where it can get a little different. They used data from the NHL website as well, but they found that probability of score, they tried to find it within 10-second divisions. So every 10 seconds they checked what was your likelihood to score with your net empty 6-on-5 versus the likelihood of the opposing team scoring on you 5-on-6. So the team that has their goalie in net. And they found that it's like, I'm more likely to score than I am to give up this goal. Let me pull at that time compared to the previous research where it's like, oh, well, we can get the highest number of points right there. Their results were very aggressive. They said if you're in a 1-goal game, pull with 9 minutes left, which is it's very irrational. That'll scare a lot of coaches off right now. But Zaman and Tan built off that, used that Asness and Brown model, and they, using those same 10-second increments and the same data, they took into the where the play is, the zone of play, whether you're in the defensive zone, neutral zone, or offensive zone. And they created this output table to say, all right, puck is in the neutral zone, don't care about the game state, what it is. With just over 9 minutes to go, don't pull. but once you hit 9 minutes, consider pulling the goalie. That made it very simple, kind of really simplified that Asmussen Brown model for coaches to see going forward. But as you can see, analytics have become very popular within sports. You hear it all the time on sports broadcasts now. Even though I did not mention basketball specifically with peer-reviewed research, the analytical movement with that in-game decision-making would be the three-point revolution: shoot more threes, take more layups, get rid of the mid-range. But on-base percentage and sabermetrics, three-point revolution, and going forward on fourth downs are all decisions on in-game strategy. Hockey kind of just has pull the goalie. There's not really a big focus on that. The general hockey analytics are a lot better about predicting the long-term, like team, higher level insights, but not as much in-game decision-making. And that one big topic has one big angle, which is, okay, we assume it's fine, let's do that. So there is a gap in the literature about, is this strategy helping teams? So what if it's not? So what if it is? That question still remains, and that is where this research fits into that question. So to get into the sample and data collection, again, it was collected from Hockey R, and it's game summary data for the entire season. It was filtered to the 6 most recent seasons. And yes, that does include the 2019-2020 season and the 2020-21 season that were shortened due to COVID. They were included because even during those shortened seasons, where there were around 50 games played in each season, there were still enough for each team, I should say. It wasn't 50 games for the entire league. There were still enough observations to justify its inclusion. These are the 12 most important variables in the data set. And these are similar variables that were used to the when to pull research, so they fit within there. Goals for against average, or goals for average and goals against average were derived to account for the unequal number of games within those 2 seasons as well, since 82 games can be a little bit different. So some of the threats to validity, this is historical data. There are little threats to internal validity aside from instrumentation. COVID happened, but it really just impacted the number of games, not necessarily the data itself. But the biggest external threat is there is a lack of uniform strategy. Some coaches will pull at different times. There are aggressive coaches. Another thing would be the changes in roster constructions or constraints on a team. The salary cap was flat for multiple years now, and so that affected how teams could make roster decisions to improve their roster. Some players retired, some players moved teams, got traded. And then just the generalizability of these trends might change just as some teams get more aggressive. You see more aggressive pulls that can change the optimal criteria, or just or the NHL just says you can't do this anymore. I doubt that'll happen, but they could. So the research design, this is a descriptive, historical, causal comparative approach just to compare the effectiveness of it. The first step is to define what is the optimal strategy for pulling the goalie. The next is to create a panel regression with team fixed effects to calculate the expected points added from optimal pull percent. I'll explain that here in a little bit once we get to the model. And then I create a logit panel regression, this time to calculate the likelihood to make the playoffs based on a change in optimal pull percent. And then the last step is just to evaluate the model fits as well. So here are the models that were used. The first one, that is the panel with team fixed effects model. Optimal pull percent, goals for against average, and goals against average are team. Goals for against averages are the team controls. Just some teams are better at offense, some teams are better at defense, just to help control for some of that. Optimal pull percent using the optimal criteria was determined to be the percentage of time a team pulled the goalie optimally. And that model's the same for the logit panel as well. So just some of the assumptions, there has to be an independence of errors, that these model, like the error terms don't interact with each other. Data has to be homoscedastic. And the entity fixed effects being goals for and against average must remain independent of the independent variable being optimal pull percent. And just for evaluation, panel regression and statistical significance benefits teams in gaining standing points, and a logit significance in the logit regression notes how likely teams are to make the playoffs and what factors are significant in that. So as far as doing the actual research, only the first instance of 6-on-5 within that each game was included. That is to say, this is the first time the goalie was pulled in the situation where you start to see teams consider to pull the goalie. The optimal pull criteria was set at 3 minutes remaining, 180 game seconds. That is a lot cleaner to use in the data than minutes itself. The goal differential of 1, so one team is winning by 1 goal, or losing, but like difference in score is just 1. Then the strength state of 6-on-5, just to make sure that this is pulling the goalie. Then sorted in, so comparing those two, are sorted it into optimal pulls versus non-optimal pulls, and then dividing optimal pulls by the total optimal plus non-optimal for a team. That would derive the optimal pull percent. But one of the fun issues I ran into was that when pulling standing points, the Vegas Golden Knights are listed as VEG on Hockey Reference, whereas the NHL has them listed as Vegas Golden Knights, VGK. So, you know, fun figuring that stuff out when they're the only team that had a different abbreviation. And they've been VGK their entire time. They never used VEG. It's weird. And then I identified which teams made the playoffs by who played more than 82 games in the full data set. Just if you've played more than 82 games, you made the playoffs. It doesn't matter if you made it all the way to the cup final or you just played in the first round. You did that. And so each of that analysis was done per season, and that compiled into one final data frame, which included these descriptive statistics. So we have 188 teams across the 6 years. And so this is the goals for and against average for those teams. All these descriptives are for those teams, all their, the playoff is a binary variable. However, the Vegas Golden Knights entered the league in 2017-18. So the league sat at 30 teams for the first season included in this analysis. And then from 17-18 to 2020-21 sat at 31. So 16 teams of 31 made the playoffs. And now for the last 2 seasons, the NHL added the Seattle Kraken to be 32 teams. So 16 out of 32 made it a perfect half. I'll worry about that later. But so that's why it's a little bit higher than 1, because most of the time, or higher than average, higher than 0.5 exactly. But it is just a binary variable to help indicate which team make the playoffs for the model itself. And you can see teams pulled optimally just about half the time. But just to show some histograms of the actual like 2 main variables, optimal pull percent. Yes, the KS test says it's not statistically significant, not normal, excuse me, but it looks normal. There's enough data points, you can kind of just assume normality. The standing point 1 is normally distributed, and that black line is the average playoff line, like average points needed to make the playoffs over this time frame. And that was around 96 points, which would roughly equate to 40, or you have to win about half your games consistently to make the playoffs. But moving on to model fit. So to evaluate the model fit, you use R squared and adjusted R squared for the panel regression. And the R squared for that is 0.656 and 0.58 for the adjusted. So that says that 65% of the variance is accounted for within this model, which is pretty good. It can definitely be improved upon, and I'll get on some of my thoughts on that later. For the logit panel regression, the Bayesian information criterion and and the log likelihood for the logit panel are the best ones, and values closer to 0 are more indicative of good fit for those two. And some places I did see that log likelihood, the further you are from 0 in the negative is better. But still, those are lower, especially compared to the panel regression model. I did have issues trying to find the statistical fit of the model using a p-value. Some of that was that it appears some of these variables might have thrown off R a little bit with where they're related or not, but I was unable to find a correct workaround to actually indicate that. However, I am assuming that there is good fit based on, and that these models are significant based on these R squared and other values. So moving on to the actual results, we can see the optimal pull percent is not statistically significant in either model. It does not help teams gain standing points, and it does not increase their likelihood to make the playoffs. So for goals for against average, it is statistically significant in both models. So for every 1 goal increase in goals for average, a team is expected to gain almost 40 points in the standings, which with how a goal a game is a lot. I'll get into some more of that later. And then, but their playoff chances increased by roughly 0.7%. Goals against average is only statistically significant within the standing points model. So for every increase or decrease, gain or lose, roughly 14 points, but not significant to making the playoffs. But the main conclusion for optimal pull percent is that this does not help or hurt teams. There is no clear indication of how much it helps or hurts a team. But so teams could continue to pull their goalie, or they could invest in other strategies, being roster construction, offensive strategies. Maybe you try getting a better goaltender so you're not letting in as many goals. That can also play into goals for and against. Goals for is the easiest way to increase your chances, even just in practical view, because teams can outscore their problems to get to the playoffs. Once you get into the playoffs, it can be a different factor, but a better offense is typically more indicative of teams that make the playoffs. You could just have a goalie go on a massive run and help, but goals for is a really big indicator. Goals against average is significant to standing points, but not likelihood to make the playoffs. I still find this one weird because to me, an increase in goals against average going from 1 goal against average to 2 goals against average means I'm giving up more goals, but I am gaining points in the standings for doing that. It's a little confusing. However, some of that can be attributed to just pace of play. The team has a higher offense, a better offense, or more high flying speed, like the Edmonton Oilers. They can fly through the those counterattacks can be a little bit more devastating. Some of that might be accounted for within the increase in goals for. Goals against average also not being significant with playoff helping is also confusing. I do think it has the better right thing. So like I gain a goal against average, I'm losing likelihood to make the playoffs, where if I'm going down in goals against average, I'm more likely to make the playoffs based on the coefficient sign. I just typically teams with better defense will fare well and end up in a better spot. But both of those variables do line up with some reasonable, like observable practices as well. Still just weird to see. But some of the limitations, just going back to that lack of uniform strategy, and some of it can just be the pace of play where you're just getting worked and you don't really have a chance to. Another thing I thought about was that coaches change positions within the data set. For example, Peter DeBoer is first accounted for with the Sharks in 2016-17, and then he coached Vegas for 3 years, and then he has 1 year where he's coaching the Stars. And so his strategy can affect the different teams throughout, accounting for that. The big one is that this is only in 1-goal games. Some teams will pull with 2 goals, or like if they're really desperate and they need these wins to do so. But some of the previous research did indicate that can get a little bit wonkier with numbers, and you more likely to lose longer you have your net empty. And then there could also be more team control indicators, goals for, against, and average. That can be a little, that is the kind of the baseline. But a lot of this can also include, you could include team like star players, teams who would be on the ice for the 6-on-5 or 5-on-6, who are the best defenders. That might be a better way to help take into account some of the player controls as well. But so to wrap it all up, yes, pulling the goalie does not have an effect on the playoffs or standing points, but it's also not hurting them. It's kind of this ambiguous ground of there is more research needed on what can be defined. You can change the optimal strategy, but teams can continue to do it. They can also invest in the other strategies as well. It still does remain a high risk, high reward strategy, but in the end, everyone still uses it because everyone still wants to taste from Lord Stanley's Cup. And that is all I have for today. Yeah.
You kind of brought it up a couple times, but I just thought kind of interesting concept when I was thinking about the whole thing you're talking, but how much does hockey do like optimizing your roster? And how much do you value that instead of just time in the game, actually thinking about who's playing who?
Some coaches are line matchers is what I would call it, where they're like, okay, this line's out there. I want to deploy this line on my own roster. You can include some of that. As far as like general managers go, I do know that it is on the rise for that decision making where they are like, hey, we need to address this area that we're lacking in, and so they will research, and there's a lot more optimization of rosters going on. Rosters are getting consistently better. I think you would have to go control for the seasons a lot more, and that can go into some of the limitations I just brought up, where it is like you can control for who might be on the ice, the star power, like the offensive qualities of player on the ice as well. But that can be hard to control for within the current setup as well at times. So.
The penalties play in terms of, the water. Do you ever get down more than one person?
You can go down to the minimum amount of skaters you can have due to penalties is 5-on-3. Like you can be down to 3 skaters. You can't go any lower than that. Just you get more power play time if someone takes a penalty when they're down to 3 players. Those situations are a lot rarer. Like if someone is down to 3 players, it's a lot rarer. I mean, you can see penalties called late in the game. But that is all, but most of the time that'll just be 5-on-5. Penalties do play a factor, and that's part of why we had to limit it to the 3rd period, because teams can pull when you have a delayed penalty, teams, you cannot get scored on, so teams will pull their goalie for that extra attacker to try to negate the power play. But normally, teams are just trying to focus only on like with the penalties going down to 3 players. It can be included in there. It was just sometimes it's not really a common factor at the end of the games if they're down to that few players. Sorry.
Well, I apologize, you already mentioned this, it became late.
You're good.
Teaching, but did you talk about why you chose these the optimal pull criteria? What was that based on?
So okay, I did forget to mention some of this. So the criteria being set at 3 minutes, that was kind of based on the common findings within the win to pull research. Goal differential of 1 is just because that's the most common strategy among coaches to use, is just 1 goal games rather than 2. There's a ton of different philosophies. Some coaches won't pull if they're down 2 unless they absolutely have to have it in a playoff hunt. And then straight state 6-on-5 was just for just because that is the most common time that you'll see it. So did I answer your question? Sorry, I don't want to cut it off to the question.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I saw a chat question. I also just wanted to read that quickly. But just so everyone understands, why did you include them if they have limited data compared to the other teams who are in the data set? So those So these teams were included because it's not so much about the teams themselves, it's just about the observations of the teams in the league. It's more a league-wide analysis than not including Vegas or Seattle in that case. It was just because it is a league-wide comparison, and yes, the league does expand through there. But these team controls were only for the specific seasons that they were accounted for, rather than all of the rather than the individual teams themselves and their performance. The teams were just the value to get to the league rather than all of that.
Do you have any way of pulling who's pulling their goalie? Because my assumption would be, let's use Boston Bruins from last year, who were just murdering everybody. I would guess they didn't pull their goalie very often.
Yeah, so
And
that's where
teams-
that's where optimal polls versus non-optimal polls come. They were sorted by the team and their
Okay.
count of optimal polls and all that. So all right. I'll go back to so on this descriptive, so like one observation is one team for that season
Okay.
based on all of this. So for last year's Bruins, for the example, so they had a goals for against of that in that season, a goals against average of that in that season, and then they pulled their goalie this many times optimally versus not optimally. That would be their goalie pool.
But I guess my question is more of those in the 188 samples, if most of those, say 150 of them are from the bottom third of the league, would that really help their playoff chances? I'm more going for if it's bad teams who are pulling their goalie and then losing, are those teams gonna make the playoffs anyway, even if they pulled their goalie or not? And that might be why you're not finding an effect on playoff performance.
It very well could be, but that was some of the idea of contributing with the goals for and against
Okay.
average.
Yeah.
The controlling for the team quality itself, just using basic offensive and defensive metrics. Because yes, you are right, we do include teams like the San Jose Sharks this year who were terrible.
Yeah.
And they fired their coach for some reason. But not like, that was why it's like, okay, so the Bruins they have a really high goals for against average and a goals against average, a really low goals against average, which is good. And so while they may not be pulling it optimally, that team, it is trying to control for that factor. This is a really good team. This is a really bad team. So
I just wondered if that might be the reason you're not finding a significance on.
It very-
effect on the playoff.
it very well could be, but at the same time, everyone has a chance to make the playoffs to at least start the year.
Yeah.
And so just focusing on, I also found that focusing on like later half years can just be,
Yeah.
that can be its own mess.
Good presentation.
Thank you. You're not gonna get your question out.
You've
Um,
got 188 sort of team seasons that are there, like.
So if I remember it's not, I'll share my desktop for this so the Zoom people can see as well. I can pull this up. I believe there were,
I mean, it's about 20 per team per season. is
Yeah.
that right?
yes, I believe that like the way my data is sorted out is that I can see the different seasons, like how many instances of the first time that a 6-on-5 did happen. I can give you an exact answer. It's gonna take our studios.
It's not-
But there's,
How large that number was.
there's like almost 500 observations per the 4 full seasons that are in there, compared to the COVID seasons that are short.
That'll get into the
Yeah.
limited grants thing,
Yeah.
but there's, you know, there's only actually a small range of the teams that do it in a very, you know.
Yeah.
At the end of the season, whatever matters.
Yeah.
Might you have a sort of total sample that was small enough that
Yeah.
might sort of just be capable.
Yeah.
Then my next question is, so you were looking at whether they pulled them at an optimal time or not. Do you have the data on when they do pull the goalie, do they actually score? Or do they score or give up a goal? Is it even an effective strategy to begin with?
Right. I I struggled with finding a way to code that within the data, just, it was a hard thing to figure out because I don't like the way the NHL set this up, to be quite honest, because they have it to where it's like event team, but it can change between them. And to me, well, to them, empty net goal is the team 5-on-6 scores. But then they have something that says extra attacker, but it's not tracked on goals, which would have been the best way to solve that. But it was hard to wrangle that within there. And just so for the full seasons, Dr. Fleck, there were roughly 700 observations of goalie pulls throughout the
So
season.
it's quite.
Yes, yeah. I mean, and even the 56 game 2020-21 season almost had 500. So they're
They'll just be curious, one, how successful is it, how does 6-on-5 compare to 5-on-4?
Right.
Like,
Right. It is often considered an effective power play by doing that, since you have one unmarked man. Colton?
So one thing that I'm curious about, kind of playing off that, is kind of like Dr. White kind of mentioned, like teams pulling at the end of the season when they're in the playoff hunt. In terms of the distribution of, like, do you know, and it might not be that relevant, I'm just curious, do you know if there is like, at what point in the season teams pull the goalie more often? Like, teams do it more at the beginning of the season? Or is it more localized towards certain teams at the end of the season?
I don't have that offhand.
You're good.
My general knowledge would say later in the season. Because kind of as this anecdote I was telling before I hit record, the Red Wings needed to pull their goalie in Montreal to score to get to overtime. They needed a win and a Capitals loss in any fashion to make the playoffs. So they're 6-on-5 to try to keep their playoff hopes alive. The Flyers are playing the Capitals. The Flyers need a regulation win to keep their playoff chances alive. The Capitals need a win in any fashion, and they clinch the playoffs, no other strings attached compared to the Red Wings. So Philadelphia, trying to keep their playoff hopes alive in game 82, pulled their goalie in a tied game. And as the Red Wings score to tie it up with 3 seconds left in the game, Washington hits the empty net, effectively sealing their playoff berth and ending the Wings. So that's my anecdotal example to say I would assume it'd be a lot later in the season as playoff positioning on that playoff line gets a lot more impactful.
I was just curious,
Yeah.
because I kind of went earlier, like, if bad teams don't have a chance to make the playoffs, then why would they pull their goalie? At the beginning of the season, everyone theoretically had the chance to make the playoffs. So I
And
didn't know if
that goes back to the win maximizer assumption, because if a coach keeps losing, they're just gonna get fired. Or, he could be saddled with a bad roster and they could still fire him.
Great job, though. Thank you.
Sorry, I weave in general talk.
You're good.
Their day. Thank you so much.
Good job, David.
Thank you all for coming to the Zoom part. Appreciate it.